One day, historians may regard the mass purging of the unvaccinated soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen as one of America's worst government atrocities, a near repeat of Stalin's political purge of the 1930s. That's, of course, unless the left controls those histories. Today on Restoration Spotlight. I'm Hayden Ludwig. My guest today is Tommy Waller, a retired lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps who ultimately left his military service over the Biden administration's COVID-19 vaccine mandate. Now Tommy leads the Center for Security Policy, one of the most important think tanks identifying the least discussed threat to America's national security, not from Russia nor Iran, but from our vulnerable electrical grid, the only piece of critical infrastructure whose failure could mean the end of America as we know it. Tommy Waller, welcome to Restoration Spotlight.
Yeah, it's an honor to be on. Thank you.
So, Tommy, when you joined the Marine Corps more than 20 years ago, you probably didn't expect a stellar career of service to end over a vaccine. So walk our viewers through your story and what convinced you to take a stand against Biden's illegal COVID mandate.
Yeah, well, I swore into the Marine Corps on my 18th birthday. That's when I took that oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, right? And I kind of told myself that I wanted to serve. I felt called to serve since I was a young child. And I told myself I wouldn't leave until I was forced to. And that's, in fact, exactly what happened.
Prescient.
With that mandate. And so I had the blessing of being able to serve in the infantry and the reconnaissance community, the force recon community, and the Marines. And Iraq, Afghanistan, all of those tested, the courage of service members, but nothing tested us like that mandate when it came to moral courage and when it came to the oath that we took. And so I'd be happy, Hayden, to go through sort of the saga of that mandate and how it affected a lot of different service members. But I have to say that personally, I feel blessed that I was able to finish my command at 3rd Force Recon Company, where I was the CO, and I was able to retire. There were so many service members that suffered far worse than I did. And the unfortunate thing is that, unfortunately, they haven't been restored. Most of them haven't. In fact, very, very few, despite President Trump's commitment to allow them back in and to course correct the damage that was previously done.
Yeah, walk us through that. I mean, you're not, I don't want to use the phrase success story. I think the better phrase is you're one of the individuals who landed on his feet despite the great evil perpetrated against you here. But you're right, many of our heroes have not. So do give us some of the background here from an insider's perspective, because all of us do remember the COVID mandates, remember how bad they got. We also remember that we feared they'd get a lot worse, but most of us were not inside the federal government apparatus where they hit hardest and first. So tell us what that was like.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just say that part of the blessing that I had was that I was serving in the reserves, and my civilian occupation is with our nonprofit Center for Security Policy, right? And our mission at the Center for Security Policy is to provide uncompromised analysis on what threatens the republic and then unconventional solutions to keep Americans safer. So that uncompromised analysis I had become accustomed to for over a decade, looking at problem sets facing the republic in a way that unfortunately many in government don't. And we can talk, Hayden, about lots of different problem sets in that regard. But when it comes to this, the vaccine mandate, here's some key observations that I'd like your audience to realize from an insider's perspective. First and foremost, there was a very highly organized data harvesting operation across the federal enterprise, but specifically in those institutions that have something to do with intelligence, gathering intelligence, or the execution of violence on behalf of the United States government. So what I'm talking about is intelligence community, federal law enforcement, and specifically the United States military. Hayden, I never witnessed anything so organized from an administrative perspective as the procedures that were laid out to harvest the data on our strongly held religious beliefs.
Wow.
And once we provided that data in the form of religious accommodation requests, right? So the narrative was, hey, don't worry. there's going to be a process for religious accommodations. All you have to do is follow these steps and tell us your strongly held religious beliefs. And then we'll go through this process of accommodations. Now, once the federal enterprise received that data, then it was an exceptionally brutal purge of all of those who requested religious accommodations. The Marine Corps was perhaps the most brutal. You have to credit the Marine Corps when they're going to do something, they do it 1,000%. So
Sure.
for
Yes.
whatever reason, the hierarchy of the United States Marine Corps at that time decided deliberately to inflict as much pain as possible upon the young service members. So in the Marines, what they did is they did a blanket denial of all of the religious accommodations on the Marine Corps birthday, 10 November. So that was a moral injury. And then what they did after that is, for all of us that tried to appeal that process, as they separated young Marines, they actually used administrative tools to brutally punish those Marines. So, for example, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or UCMJ, is sort of the legal framework with which we work in the military. There were two separation codes that would have been most appropriate if you're going to separate a Marine over refusing this experimental shot. You could use the code for refusing medical treatment or the code for refusing inoculation. The U.S. Marine Corps leadership decided to use what's called commission of a serious offense. That's a misconduct code that then allows the commanders to be able to strip the honorable characterization of service for that young Marine and to be able to try to deny him educational benefits, future employment, making it absolutely as painful as possible and as demoralizing as possible on that young Marine. And so I was witness to all of that. It was absolutely atrocious. And I did everything I could to stand and protect my Marines until the point that I realized that there was no unit in the Marine Corps that would take me, despite trying to join units. And then after a year of having appealed to the Marine Corps, I put in my retirement paperwork. Hayden, that's the second thing I've seen that was amazing when it comes to administrative prowess in the United States Marine Corps, which was the speed with which my retirement was processed. It normally takes 4 months. 2 weeks after I submitted for my retirement, I had a package with that stamp, that auto pen signature of Joseph Biden saying, "Hey, you're done." Right. So very highly organized.
Highly organized, like it's a Stalinist campaign. I think that's the only other purge that you can really compare this to. The purge of the officer corps 90 years ago in the Soviet Union. The efficiency, the speed, the ruthlessness. Tommy, I think you and I both agree that to a large degree anyway, the culture war is really a spiritual war. But usually the left doesn't acknowledge that. I think one of the things you're saying is, here's an instance where you had the entire federal government under Democrat control saying, yes, it is a spiritual war, and you're and my enemy, I'm going to purge you for that. And I just have to think the long-term damages, not only morally to our country, but you have now removed many of the finest warriors from across all the armed forces, right at a time when America faces incredible dangers from China or Iran or Russia. I know we're talking about, electrical grid and everything like this, but please give us some idea here about the permanent damage that you see as a result of that massive purge.
Yeah, I would say that the damage is definitely long lasting. I don't want to say it's permanent because I think you and I both agree that we worship the God of the impossible, right? So anything is
well
possible.
Said. Yes.
But it's really, I would say, thorough and long lasting. I mean, I think about even my last experience when I tried. It was that appeal process. I was waiting to see would they take my appeal for the denial of my religious accommodation, and my ID card expired. So I was going to go on base and get a new ID. I brought my whole family, dressed in their Sunday's best, and showed up at that base, and I was denied access. I just wanted to bring my family on board to see the Memorial of Fallen Marines. And I was denied access over what was called, COVID protocol. That I looked at my wife, 21 years, having, sacrificed so much, tears streaming down her face. My children, who saw their dad leave so many times and sacrifice so much. Just the fact that, previous to that, I commanded the only independent force recon company in the Marine Corps, had a top secret security clearance, and had worked in that building for 3 years, and had a guy with a top secret security clearance on the other side of the gate ready to escort me to a non-classified space to honor our fallen. And so those types of injuries, those cut deep, right? And so that's just one story. And mine doesn't pale in comparison. So if you think about across the country where fathers and mothers of American service members are having their sons and daughters explain to them this type of persecution, what that does is it dissuades that type of individual and that family lineage from continuing to serve. Hayden, your name bears the same spelling and everything. I think about it. Hayden Robichaux, a good friend of mine, Chad Robichaux, one of our board members. His family had over 60 years of unbroken service to the United States military, and yet the U.S. military, his son Hayden, who bears your name, they absolutely persecuted him, kicked him out, took everything, his ID card, his socks, his belt. His wife was pregnant with their first child, and they jettisoned him so fast and brutally, and they broke that lineage of service. And so I think, in many cases, look, a lot of officers were just kind of trying to do what they're told. They're very busy. They didn't have a circumstance like me, where I had a civilian job at the Center for Security Policy, right? So everybody had different decisions to make. But Hayden, let me tell you, the one thing besides the religious persecution that I think was unique about this purge was what they made it about. Okay. And so what separates the United States of America from 5,000 years of human history of tyranny is one word. And that was the one word that they made every officer have to make a choice about. And that word is consent, right? So the consent of the government. When I took an oath to this U.S. Constitution, this was given to me by the parents of an only child who died of wounds sustained in combat under my command. And they said, Tommy, never forget what he died for. What this Constitution represents is the consent of the governed. And what they did to officers in the U.S. military is they gave us an order that was impossible to execute without breaking the law, specifically denying young service members informed consent. Because the law says that an experimental medical procedure of any type, a vaccine, that you have to have what's called informed consent in order to comply. And they put us in a position as officers where we had to take that consent away. And I think that was another significant litmus test for the officer corps of the United States military. And depending on how you look at it, from whatever perspective, if you're looking at it from a Marxist perspective, it was an incredible success. If you're looking at it from the perspective of someone who cares about consent to the governed, we catastrophically failed.
I mean, this is just stunning, Tommy. We could talk about this all day. I do want to talk about your work now. You have a defense background, obviously. You lead the Center for Security Policy. I think what's unusual, most people expect people who work in think tanks that deal with national security policy to be dealing with, classic military threats. Are we going to lose the next war? You have a different métier. You look more at threats to our infrastructure, specifically the electrical grid. This is a massive topic that nobody ever talks about. And I do want to dive into the particulars here, give some recent real-world examples, but please start out with a 30,000-foot view, what your interest comes from, by the way, and also why people should take this threat seriously.
Sure. Yeah. Well, let me just say, our Center for Security Policy, I mentioned before that mission statement of uncompromised analysis. That uncompromised analysis is both on ideological threats, right? And I know you've had some of our team members on and talk about threats like Antifa, right. Islamic Jihad, right? And look how we lost the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's because of a failure to understand the threat doctrine, Sharia, right? So there's ideological threats that we cover down on and are uncompromised, and then infrastructure threats as well. The other part, Hayden, about that uncompromised analysis is the fact that we don't take funding from the government at any level, from any foreign sources, or from any companies that could profit off of our recommendations. So let's look, like you said, 30,000 feet at our critical infrastructure. All 16 critical infrastructures depend on electricity. That makes the electric grid the most critical of all critical infrastructures. And so the Center for Security Policy for more than 10 years has sponsored what's known as the nationwide Secure the Grid Coalition. And that I've had the privilege of leading that. And Hayden, part of the blessing of having this incredible job that I have to tell you, I didn't even apply for the job at the Center for Security Policy more than 15 years ago. Honestly, it was the day I truly gave it up to God. Like, hey, what do you want me to do with my life? And I just laid it on his feet, and I got a call about a job I didn't apply for. That being said,
I love that.
Huge. Yeah, I mean, it's a great story. One day we have to share the whole thing. But what I'm telling you is such a blessing to have the ability to then be mentored by some of the world's foremost experts on threats to the grid. And so, in fact, it allowed me the opportunity to be invited to serve in the military on a unique task force, the U.S. Air Force Electromagnetic Defense Task Force that looked at threats like electromagnetic pulse or EMP. And so, like you said, at the 30,000 foot level, what we know is this: American civilization, any modern civilization, cannot live without electricity. And so the just staggering prospect of loss of life that could come from a protracted long-term blackout it's really worrisome to our organization. So we've done everything we can, we continue to do, to prevent that type of tragic loss of life, and really what could be a loss of sovereignty. And Hayden, that's what every one of our adversaries understands. They see the electric grid as the Achilles heel of the United States of America, and they have it in their sights to attack. And I'd be happy to talk about the various ways that they could attack it, and also some natural hazards that could take it down.
Yeah, I do want to cover all of those. So let's show people why this matters. So everything from food to transportation, banking, hospitals, your work has shown this, all depends on the electrical grid. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is a catastrophic attack on one element of the electrical grid, you take one chunk of it down, can tear down the entire grid. And once it's down, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to bring it all back online. That may be a layman's understanding here, but give us the understanding of the vulnerability on that level.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Hayden, I mean, what you're talking about is what's known as a cascading blackout, right? So think about back August 14, 2003, what was known as the Great Northeast Blackout. You had a single tree branch in Ohio hit a transmission line, and that caused a series of cascading blackouts, which resulted in about 55 million customers without electricity, some for up to 2 weeks. That was a single point failure, right? And so because of the interconnected nature of the grid, there are various types of threats that can cause those cascading blackouts. And so the most worrisome for us, at least right now, in terms of widespread long-term blackouts, are in the electromagnetic spectrum, right? And that's why I worked for that task force. So we're talking about the one that we've known about since the 1950s and 60s, which is nuclear electromagnetic pulse. Most people have heard of EMP. They might, accuse you of having a, quote, tinfoil hat and being a conspiracy theorist if you care about it. But I will tell you that the U.S. Defense Department has spent billions of dollars hardening its nuclear enterprise and command and control against EMP. It's a real threat, and it can take the grid down for a very long time. And then the natural form of electromagnetic pulse, solar weather, geomagnetic disturbances. And Hayden, I'll tell you what, it's just great timing for us to be talking about this. And I do think we should also talk about some of the other threats. But on this one, this particular threat, just this past week, we provided a very, very detailed set of recommendations to the Department of Energy on how we can fix that threat. The good news, so the bad news, it's 100% certain going to happen, because there is a completely defective standard that the utilities have to abide by to protect against it. So they can be protected without actually doing anything or installing any hardware. That's the bad news. So it's 100% certain it's going to happen. The good news is it's a fixable problem. It can be done with a one-time expenditure of about $4 billion nationwide. And the comments we provided the Department of Energy are the entire playbook. And we had probably, which is the most authoritative report on this specific threat and that solution that has ever been produced, that we just finished last week and provided it as intellectual ammunition for the Department of Energy. And we're also providing it to leaders at the state level so we can get a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach to secure our grid against that threat, which we can't deter.
Let's thank God for that. Let's talk about a really specific example that happened last April in the Iberian Peninsula. And from a layman's perspective, again, my understanding is that Spain experienced an overvoltage related to its dependence on renewable energy. Overvoltages do happen, though, regardless. That triggered a cascade of power plant failures that affected Portugal, spread all the way over to the Pyrenees. France automatically disconnected its power grid to prevent a continent-wide shutdown. But what happened was, in a few minutes, two countries, modern countries with modern infrastructure, went completely dark. Now, you think about what this means. You're in the hospital. Suddenly your lights go off. You have no electricity. You're in a subway tunnel on a train. Everything shuts down. That's terrifying. And I don't think people spend enough time thinking about this. So walk us through a little bit of what happened there. I'm putting you on the spot here, but also what this would look like in a real world situation, perhaps with an EMP. And by the way, that wasn't a terror attack, but it easily could have been.
Yeah. So Hayden, I mean, look, what you're describing that happened in the Iberian Peninsula is a new threat to the grid, which is self-imposed. Okay. So when I started this job, 15 years ago, we said, hey, there's really four main threats to the grid. You have, we talked about already, nuclear electromagnetic pulse. You have solar weather, right? Cyber attack, and then just physical sabotage, right? Which is very simple. There are two more now. One is supply chain, right? So an adversary putting into your supply chain things that they can use to turn the lights off. And then our own government policies, right? And those last two really are what resulted in the Iberian blackout, which should be a cautionary tale for the United States of America, because what they did in Spain and Portugal is they shut down lots of baseload power generators, okay? So the big fossil fuel, coal, those types of plants that provide large forms of generation. So let's, for just a second, for your audience, I can explain how this happened, right?
Please, yes.
Our grid operates on what's called alternating current, or AC. An AC grid, usually that electricity is produced by forms of generators, right, that spin, big spinning generators. So think big turbines. And whether those turbines are turned by combusting natural gas or steam from a nuclear power plant or a coal plant, there's a lot of momentum, okay? And what that means is that momentum in that grid as it operates is sort of a buffer when there are issues and the frequency is potentially dropping, right? Because that AC frequency has to be maintained. Then those large generators provide a certain amount of buffering, okay? So think about it like this. You're a child on a swing set. You're swinging back and forth, and you're oscillating back and forth. Our grid oscillates with a certain frequency. When you attach renewables to the grid, when I'm talking specifically about solar and wind, that's direct current energy, DC energy, which means it has to be converted. Inverters have to take that DC power and convert it into AC power. When you attach large amounts of that, you diminish the amount of big rotators like, the baseload power generators, then let's say that oscillation you're swinging your swing set, you can have what's called subsynchronous oscillation. And so the wind and solar systems can cause this subsynchronous oscillation. So think you're the child on the swing set and someone grabs the chain and jerks it.
Yes.
All of a sudden you're swinging out of control. And what do? You jump off the swing set to keep yourself safe. That's exactly what you described, Hayden, when those grid operators shut the grid down and they separated it from other countries to prevent more damage that could happen. Okay, and so the cautionary tale for the United States of America is twofold. Number one, you don't shut down your baseload power generators the way the Biden administration did with coal and nuclear and over-attach renewables like wind and solar. Physics will not allow you to continue operating the grid in a reliable way. And that's what we saw. The second thing is this, which was not, we have no evidence that this could have been a foreign adversary manipulating that wind and solar systems, but the supply chain vulnerabilities introduced into the grid infrastructure of modern civilizations that rely on the People's Republic of China to produce those items opens you up to all sorts of man-made grid disasters, right? And so that's why, I wrote recently at the National Interest an article that said the big beautiful bill stopped the bleeding on energy suicide. The United States of America under the Biden administration was taking part in energy suicide. And thank God that the Trump administration has taken a lot of steps to stop that energy suicide. Think about it like a trauma patient. They put tourniquets on, we stop shooting ourselves, and we put some quick clot in those wounds. But there's still a lot of life-sustaining care that needs to be applied to the grid. And that's exactly what we're providing in terms of recommendations to the Trump administration right now.
Let's talk more about the CCP. It's very well known right now. Obviously, China has been engaged in cyber warfare for a long time, trying to infiltrate state and local, regional, even utility grids. There's one case in Massachusetts years ago that's very well known that they were present for years. But we now know that they have kill switches on certain elements of the electrical grid, I believe it's solar panels, that have been imported into the United States. That is, somebody could go from Beijing, remote into that piece of hardware and shut it off. So you don't have sovereignty over your electrical grid if somebody else can step in and monkey with it. That's one problem we're already facing. The other thing I want to talk with you, Tommy, is the threat of if an actual kinetic war broke out between the United States and the CCP. That's not a war that's only fought over there. That's a war where you can have infiltrators, perhaps people who came over the open border under Biden, who actually do physically damage the United States' electrical grid. And that's a lot of places to try and keep secure over a massive country at the same time. It's probably not feasible. So walk us through the state of that vulnerability with China right now vis-a-vis the solar panels. And if things did heat up over Taiwan in the next few years, what should people expect?
Yeah, Hayden. Well, let me start first with background on Chinese warfighting doctrine. Okay, so if you, and this is again Center for Security Policy, what we do is we look at what the adversary's doctrine is, and we take them at their word for what they say and they write about us. And so, what did the Chinese say and write about us? Well, in two People's Liberation Army colonels wrote a book called Unrestricted Warfare.
I have it. It's a great read.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so, and I'm going to try to remember the exact page here, but your listeners, your viewers, if they want, they can literally Google search Unrestricted Warfare PDF, and they'll pull up a CIA translation of the document. But if you go to it, and I want to say it's on like page 155, but there's a whole scenario that they lay out where two developed countries go to war. Okay, the scenario is Taiwan. They don't say it, but two developed countries go to war, and one of them attacks all of the civilian infrastructure, specifically the grid and all these other networks, to grind to a halt that adversary's internal domestic ability to live and operate, and cause tons of confusion. Hayden, it's amazing how they literally write it out, okay? And this is like 30 years ago. And what the Chinese have done is they've positioned themselves to do exactly that, okay? So that's first. Unrestricted warfare is the doctrine. They have used that doctrine and followed it to the T. And how? Okay, so when you asked about, the scenario, say for Taiwan, for example, so you mentioned before solar panels, inverters. Remember, both wind and solar have to use inverters to take DC power and convert it to AC. Most of those converters are made in China, those inverters, right? Second thing, the Biden administration had this massive investment in battery energy storage systems called BESS, BESS. Most of those battery energy storage systems are made in China. In fact, one that was procured by Duke Energy and deployed at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, had to be ripped out. Why? Because the Chinese have remote control to them. In fact, Attorney General Paxton in Texas just issued, some word about investigations that the state of Texas is doing into those BESS systems. So you've got panels, inverters, battery energy storage systems, and we know that high voltage transformers, those are the backbone of our large grid. We've found, the United States government, under the Trump administration's first term, found that one of the transformers brought into the country had a hardware backdoor in it that could allow someone remotely to shut it off, right? And unfortunately, on the Biden administration's first day in office, they reversed the Trump, they canceled a Trump administration executive order that was meant to stop the importation of Chinese transformers. And now we have over 500 in the U.S. grid. We had about 300 then. So all of those are various components. There are other ways. In fact, Senator Rick Scott, Florida, passed, or he didn't pass a bill, but he filed a bill, I hope it passes, called the Protect the Grid Act. And this is the last one I'll mention, which is called it's MAIOT, MADIOT, okay? The manipulation of demand of the Internet of Things. So think about Americans are investing in all sorts of technology, washers and dryers and washing machines and appliances that are smart, right? They're connected to the internet. Well, that technology, if it can connect to the internet, if it can be manipulated by a foreign adversary, they can increase or manipulate the demand on the grid dramatically and cause it to collapse, okay? And so this bill, the Protect the Grid Act, is meant to look at those types of infrastructure to figure out which ones could be used to cripple the grid. And that goes from everything from your washer and dryer and AC thermostat to crypto mining and think about crypto mines and data centers and how much, right? So these are all things that the Chinese have in their doctrine and have specifically targeted, and they have incentivized and influenced the U.S. government and certain administrations to invest in them and place it all in our grid.
Now, how aware is the Trump administration of these threats that you're obviously bringing to the table, and what actions have been taken other than the ones you've already shown here? I guess really what I'm driving at is how much more prepared and hardened is the country now than it was 5 years ago, for instance, against these threats?
So the good news is that the leadership of the Trump administration that I've had the privilege of being able to interact with is dramatically different than the previous administration. Okay. So, for example, when I briefed Secretary Granholm 4 times, she was always very polite and she was very, pleasant. But her team and the Biden administration, they pretty much did the opposite of everything we would ever recommend. So I stopped briefing her. Okay. And that became extremely disappointing. On the other hand, the Trump administration people that I've briefed, I could not be more impressed with their seriousness, the work ethic, the passion, and the realism, right? Where, the previous administration, you would bring them real concrete facts, and they lived what appeared to be like a fantasy land of imagining how you can electrify everything, electric vehicles, all these different things, and shut down baseload power generators like coal and nuclear, and somehow miraculously just depend on the sun and wind right? The Trump administration people right now have a very realistic outlook. The bad news is it will take a long time to fix this. We can't just snap our fingers and fix it overnight. And that is the really concerning thing. So we're on a good path. As I mentioned before, the Trump administration has stopped the energy suicide, applied the different really, initial care to the trauma patient. But Hayden, there's very significant life-sustaining care that still needs to be applied. And look, our Center for Security Policy, to my knowledge, out of more than 300 respondents to the Department of Energy's recent Speed to Power request for information, ours is the one that represented the public interest. We weren't out there to try to get government contracts to make money. We were telling them the truth about what needs to be known to protect the American public. And I don't know anybody else out there that's doing it in an organized fashion. And that's what's such a blessing to have the privilege to serve the American people. Having had my military career ended abruptly, not by choice, to have the ability to keep serving the American people in this unique way, it is really a gift from God.
So, Tommy, as we close out here, Center for Security Policy deals with far more than the electrical grid. That is one large element of what you guys do. You also dig into actual domestic terrorism, not parents, but, Antifa and Sharia law advocates and the like. Tell our listeners more about the other issue areas that you guys specialize in and how they can support and follow your work.
Sure. Yeah. We're blessed with a staff that's just amazing. I mean, I'm like never the smartest guy in the room. Okay. And so if we look at, I'm serious about that, right? When we look at our team, if you think about figuring out the truth about what the American government's doing and foreign governments in the United States, thank goodness we have conservative media, right? We have podcasters, we have people like yourself who get the American people the truth about what our government's doing here. But that doesn't really exist for the international space, right? And so some of our team members, Andrei Ilarionov, this is a man that not by choice worked for Vladimir Putin as an economic advisor for many years and publicly resigned from Putin's service. And a man that understands him probably better than anyone else alive on the face of the earth. He can translate for us what is happening with respect to the Putin regime and even what the U.S. government may be doing, good or bad or otherwise, as it relates to the Russian threat. Our Middle East expert, Dr. Dave Wormser, was in Israel on October 7th, 2023, maintains an incredible network in the Middle East to cover down on that international space. Colonel Grant Newsham covering down on East Asia and China. He wrote the book, When China Attacks. So we have team members that are covering down on international threats as well. And then domestically, not only do we have the analysis on these various threats, you talked to Kyle Scheidler about Antifa, right? And the jihad threats. But we have a program more than 20 years old that has been working at the state level. Back when it started, state lawmakers, they'd say, national security, that doesn't seem like something, that seems like a federal government issue. Now, the demand for our work at the state level is dramatically increased. You mentioned before Chinese land acquisitions, all these different things. These are things we're addressing. Christopher Holton covers down on that. So this tiny little organization that's less than a squad size element, the amount of impact that we have, I mean, in 45 states over 20 years, we've helped pass more than 230 bills. That's through education and outreach, right? We're a 501c3, so we can do a certain amount of lobbying, but most of it is education, outreach, and giving the solutions to the lawmakers that they need to protect their communities. And so you asked about what can people do to help? Well, look, I'll be honest about it. People can help by donating to our organization. Like I said, we don't take government money. We don't take money from companies that can profit off of our work. And unlike many Washington, D.C. based, quote, think tanks, we take no foreign money. And so what that means is we depend upon the generosity of patriots across this country to fund the work that we do. And I'll tell you, Hayden, what's good about it is when I sit down with lawmakers. I've been asked before, I'm briefing, someone on Chinese transformers, and they'll stop me and they'll say, hey, wait a minute, who's paying for this? I'm thinking at first, who's paying for the transformer, the utility company? And they're like, no. Who's paying for this? Who's paying for you to be briefing me on this? And I will tell them what I just told you and your listeners. And Hayden, they will sit back in their chair and they will listen and they will consume that information, knowing that there's no agenda to make money, that this is specifically for the American people. And it is rare. I've had these people in the Trump administration have told me, Tommy, man, nobody does this. You know what I mean? Well, I said, well,
Wow.
we do, and that's what we're here for. And it's unique and it's a blessing.
Thank God for that. Tommy Waller, thank you so much for your service to our country and your time today.
Absolutely. Hayden, thanks for having me on. Honored to come back anytime, and would be happy to connect you with more of our team.
I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight, a project of Restoration News, your source of headline-smashing investigative journalism for the America First movement. Check us out at restoration-news.com. And until next time, stay vigilant and trust in God.